Hello, friends. We are going to explore today the subject of Theosophy as a path of yoga. So, the Theosophical tradition has a wealth of teachings, of information about many different subjects, from metaphysical subjects to very practical ones. Now, sometimes there is the tendency in students to pay more attention to the metaphysical subjects and less attention to the practical one. Now, it is important to realize that the masters who were behind the founding of the Theosophical Society had in mind that these teachings should help people practically. So here we have a quote from one of the masters. Theosophy must not represent merely a collection of moral verities, a bundle of metaphysical ethics, epitomized in theoretical dissertations. Theosophy must be made practical. It has to find objective expression in an all-embracing code of life, thoroughly impregnated with the spirit of mutual tolerance, charity, and love. So he says Theosophy must be made practical and find an objective expression in a code of life that is all-embracing. Theosophy, it's always proposes a universal view of things. So it is an all-embracing code of life that can be the expression of theosophical teachings. And he continues, the problem of true theosophy and its great mission are, first, the working out of clear, unequivocal conceptions of ethic ideas and duties, such as shall best satisfy the altruistic feelings in men. So first, working out clear conception of ethical ideals. And second, the adaptation of these conceptions into forms of daily life. So basically, the theosophical teachings should help us realize how we should live, what kind of life is a life that is in accord with the truth that theosophical teachings are trying to express. And then we should work out practical ways in which that vision can be applied into our daily life. Blavatsky mentioned something similar because if we look at this only from the practical point of view, then we may be tempted to say, okay, let us get rid of all the metaphysical teachings, the philosophy, etc., and let us just focus on ways of spiritual living. And many religions do that. Many religions are not, at least in how they reach the masses, they are not very concerned about metaphysical teachings. They are more concerned about a moral code of life. Now, I think that the theosophical approach is proposing something different. If the masters, they are clearly interested in a way of applying theosophy, but if the masters were only interested in that, they would not have spent so much energy and time in either writing these letters to the early Theosophists, from which we have a lot of metaphysical teachings. They would not have spent so much time and energy with Blavatsky in writing the Secret Doctrine. So evidently, they saw a value in people knowing highly metaphysical teachings. But at the same time, they were expecting that these teachings can be applied in a practical way. So Blavatsky says, the power to know does not come from book study, nor from mere philosophy. See, the power to know, not knowledge. Knowledge may come from books, but the power to know, how much can we know? You know, we can incorporate information, but we may not really understand what that information means beyond the meaning of the words. We may not be able to perceive the reality that these words are pointing to. So she says that the power to know does not come merely from books, but mostly from the actual practice of altruism in deed, word, and thought. So this is an interesting concept. The power to know comes from a particular way of living, a theosophical way of living, let's say. Why? She says, for that practice purifies the covers of the soul and permits its light to shine down into the brain mind. In the theosophical view, we as a soul have far more knowledge, insight, understanding than what we can show when we are expressing ourselves through a body. Because the body is a veil, is a kind of screen that presents an obstacle for us to access our intrinsic wisdom when we are acting through the body. So it is through a theosophical way of living, this kind of living that the master was describing, a way that is ethical, universal, based on charity and love, etc. This kind of living begins to purify our body, not only the physical body in the theosophical view, there are other bodies also, the astral or emotional, the mental, etc. This way of living purifies all these bodies so that the light from the soul, which is our true nature, can shine through the body so that we can retain in our waking consciousness, the consciousness that is using the body, we can retain our ability as a soul to perceive things as they are. When Blavatsky describes what she calls the higher ego, ego meaning I-ness, the higher sense of spiritual I-ness in us, she says that at that level, we have what is called inherent omniscience, meaning whatever we perceive as a soul, when we are not limited by the body, whatever we perceive it correctly as it is. Once we come into expressing ourselves through the bodies, then that possibility becomes dimmed by matter. So it is through an actual theosophical living that we can make these bodies assimilate, or first be in tune with our true nature, and then assimilate, receive, express our true nature. So she says, how do we get to do this? She says the truest way to do this is by combining philosophy with the highest outward and inward virtue. So you see, she doesn't say merely by virtuous living. She says by combining philosophy and virtuous living. And I think this is the spirit of the theosophical approach. It's not merely a philosophy, metaphysical teachings just to generate some kind of intellectual understanding. And it is not merely an ethical code of life. It is by combining both that we can realize our true nature and express it while we are incarnated in a body. We will see this in more details in the course of these two lectures. So let's see some definitions. We are talking about yoga and theosophy. So theosophy as a path of yoga. Let's see first the meaning of theosophy. Theosophy comes from the Greek theosophia, and the first part, theos, means God, a God. You know, the Greeks didn't believe in one single God. So when they say theos, they mean a God. But this has been interpreted later in the West in terms of God also. So it can be interpreted in both ways. And then Sophia is wisdom. So there are different ways of translating these two words. One would be the wisdom of a God, or the wisdom of God. The Greeks, for example, Iamblichus would talk about theurgy, which was a spiritual path in which we could raise our consciousness to the realm of the gods, let's say, and receive teachings from the gods themselves. So whatever the gods were teaching, that is a theosophia, that is a wisdom that comes from the gods. In the Christian interpretation, it would be like the prophets that receive this wisdom from God. So that would be a theosophia, that would be a wisdom coming from God. This is one of the translations. Then another translation would be wisdom in godly things, wisdom in things that pertain to gods. So this is the people who mystics and druids and occultists and different in the different traditions, we have always had people who knew about the spiritual realms. So what they knew about the spiritual realm, that's a form of theosophia. It's a knowledge in things divine, a knowledge about godly things. And then the other translation would be divine wisdom, a wisdom that is not coming from our minds, from our experience, from what the senses bring. You know, we can say that as we go through life, we acquire certain wisdom that comes from our experience in life. The Theosophia is not this kind of wisdom. It's a divine wisdom, a wisdom that is inherent in our divine nature, and that we can learn how to access that inherent spiritual wisdom. So this last interpretation is how it is used in the modern theosophical tradition as a divine wisdom, a wisdom inherent in our spiritual nature. And we see, for example, Blavatsky saying, every one of us possesses the faculty, the interior sense, known as intuition, but how rare are those who know how to develop it. It is, however, the only faculty by means of which men and things are seen in their true colors. It is an instinct of the soul, which grows in us in proportion to the use we make of it, and which helps us to perceive and understand real and absolute facts with far more certainty than can seem the simple use of our senses and reason. So she says there is a spiritual sense in us, an instinct of the soul, something inherent in the soul, that is this intuition. Not the intuition of, I feel that this is going to happen, or the intuition of the senses, from a philosophical point of view, the information that comes from the senses before they are arranged by our mind. They are a sensory intuition, that information, that knowledge. Intuition is normally used as a piece of knowledge that comes not through by means of the mind. So any information that comes directly from the senses, because before the mind engages with the interpretation of it, or any information that comes to us emotionally, like the gut feeling. All these are forms of intuition, but the intuition that Blavatsky and Theosophy normally talks about is an intuition of the soul. Sometimes it is called spiritual intuition. And this is a faculty, as Blavatsky says, we all have potentially this faculty, but it is dormant in us. Sometimes it comes to our minds in the form of an insight, but for the most part, this spiritual intuition is that inner knowledge about realities or about the world from a point of view that is not the one that our senses and our minds bring. So a certain feeling, a feeling of unity, a feeling of the reality of unity, when it is felt with a certain certainty, that is an intuition. It's not something that comes merely from the mind or from the senses. Of course, we can believe in unity merely by using our minds, but normally that doesn't bring any sense of certainty. If the sense of unity or the idea of unity is just a mental idea, when we have to deal with life and that idea of unity is challenged, we will act in ways that oppose that idea. This is why many philosophers may know everything about ethics or morality or a particular religious teacher, and yet they may not be able to act in ways that are in accord with what they are all day teaching, for example. This, of course, can happen to members of the Theosophical Society or anybody else. Information that stays only at the level of the mind doesn't necessarily have the strength to translate itself into a way of living. But the intuition, if the sense of unity comes from this spiritual intuition, then it has far more power to affect our lives. Of course, the mind may help, as Blavatsky was saying, combining the philosophy with a way of living is how we can purify the covers of the soul. So studying about unity and trying to practice unity or ways of action from the point of unity in daily life, all of these are means to stimulate this spiritual intuition that Blavatsky says is latent, but very few people use. All these means, I was saying, are ways of stimulating the spiritual intuition. And then the more that intuition awakens, the more certain the idea of unity or any other spiritual idea becomes. So she says, Plato expressed, continuing with the quote, expressed the same idea in a couple of lines. And she quotes, to become like the gods is to become holy, just and wise. That is the end for which man was created, and that ought to be his aim in the acquisition of knowledge. So to become like gods, remember Theosophia, the wisdom of the gods, or the divine wisdom, or godly wisdom. So Blavatsky says, this is true theosophy, inner theosophy, that of the soul. Because of course the word theosophy is also applied to the body of teachings. We talk about theosophical teachings, or we talk about theosophy as this particular approach. And that is a secondary theosophy, in a sense. That is the expression of theosophy. The real theosophy is this divine wisdom. It's a state of consciousness. The true theosophy, the inner theosophy, the theosophy of the soul, is a state of being wise. Wise, spiritually wise, not worldly wisdom. So the true theosophy is when, because of our study and meditation and service and practice, we will see all of this in the course of these 2 lectures. Because of all of this, we begin to be more and more in touch with that spiritual wisdom inherent in our higher nature. And that is the true theosophy that Blavatsky is talking about. So when we talk about theosophy as a path of yoga, the ultimate meaning of theosophy, the goal of this particular path, is to awaken in us this divine wisdom. And then we have the word yoga, which is very well known in the West right now. And the word yoga is translated or interpreted in different ways. It is a Sanskrit word, and traditionally in India, it has been interpreted in two main ways, although there are many varieties, many other varieties of interpretations. One is Yujir Yoge, which means to yoke, to bind two things, to bring together. Sometimes this is also interpreted in terms of union. In this sense, it is similar to the root, the Latin root of the word religion. Religion comes from religare, which means like re-link, rebind, or bind back together. So yoga, from this point of view, implies some kind of union. And then this is, for example, the interpretation we see mainly in the Bhagavad Gita, which is a sacred text in India. This is the interpretation in non-dual traditions within Hinduism, where there is the idea that the divine and the personal are not really different, not really separate. They are separate only because of our ignorance. And the aim of yoga is to bring back those two fragments that, or those two realities that seem to be separate and different, to unite them, to realize that they are one. Now, another interpretation of yoga is the second one, Yuj Samadhau, which means to gather, to concentrate, to, basically that idea. This is the interpretation used, for example, in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, an important Hindu text, where the idea of yoga is to gather all the faculties of our mind, of our consciousness, to gather them and focus them in one object of contemplation. So in this sense, this is related to other words like samadhi or concentration, contemplation, to counteract the tendency of our mind to be dispersed and bring everything into focus. And this is how yoga is interpreted. Of course, this is part of the practice, as we are going to see in the Theosophical tradition, but mainly the idea of yoga, from the point of view that we take, is as a path to union. So the yoga of Theosophy is that by means of awakening this divine wisdom, we can realize our true nature, and we can bring back into unity this separation between me and the truth, or me and the oneness, or me and the divine. We can bring back those two aspects of reality, which were never really separate, but because of ignorance, I feel I'm separate and different from the divine, for example. So because this separation is based on ignorance, the medicine, the thing that is going to correct this is wisdom. Not a worldly wisdom, but a divine wisdom. And this is how we could interpret the Theosophy as a path of yoga. Now, in this path of yoga, there are two aspects that we have to keep in mind. This idea of these two aspects underline the whole spiritual practice. Annie Besant said, human nature may be studied from two standpoints, from the side of consciousness or from the side of form. Form and life, matter and spirit, consciousness and its vehicle are inseparable in manifestation and are the indivisible aspects of that which is the root of both. So from the theosophical point of view, the origin of the manifested universe is a unitive principle of which spirit and matter are two aspects. So it's not that manifestation comes from consciousness or from spirit, as some spiritual traditions would propose. And it's not that manifestation comes just from matter, as the scientific point of view would propose. In the theosophical approach, manifestation comes from a single nature, which is beyond spirit and matter, in which spirit and matter are united, are synthesized. And this root, when manifested, expresses itself in these two aspects, spirit and matter. And those two aspects will, as long as there is manifestation, there will be these two main aspects, two lines of evolution, connected, interlinked, and playing on each other. So for example, what she's saying is that from this root, that is a unitive principle, we have spirit and matter as two primordial cosmic manifested principles. Then spirit expresses itself in what we could call life, and matter expresses itself in forms, or matter is shaped in forms, and those forms are infused with life by this other aspect of manifestation, by what we call the spirit. Then that life, when expressed through a form, it manifests as what we call consciousness. Now, this consciousness needs a form to express itself, and we call it a vehicle of consciousness. So, for example, we have the ability to see. That is an ability that is in consciousness. But for consciousness to be able to express that ability on the physical plane, for example, we need an eye. We need the vehicle of consciousness. We need an organ. We need a form. So in the theosophical view, consciousness and form are constantly acting on each other, and they are inseparable. If there is no consciousness, then there is no form. If there is no form, there is no consciousness on that level. So Annie Besant continues and says this evolution will inevitably go along two main lines. One, the side of consciousness, the other, that of the vehicles of consciousness. This possibility has led to two extremes in philosophy, both of which we must avoid, because each ignores one side of manifested life. One regards everything as consciousness, ignoring the essentiality of form as conditioning consciousness, as making it possible. The other regards everything as form, ignoring the fact that form can only exist by virtue of the life and soul in it. So, for example, we have an organ that is necessary, as we said, for the expression of consciousness. But that organ needs to be alive. If life is removed from the organ, then the organ ceases to be. In time, it just is dissolved, let's say, destroyed. So the form needs consciousness, in this case as life, to stay as a working unit. But at the same time, as we explained, consciousness cannot express itself on a particular plane unless it has an organ, a body, some kind of vehicle of expression. So we see here the interdependence of these two aspects. So when science says that consciousness is a byproduct of matter, it is erring, it is disregarding an essential aspect of the human experience, that is the consciousness aspect. Now, when spiritual philosophies say that matter is an illusion and it doesn't matter, they are also disregarding an aspect of manifested life. This may be true on spiritual planes, or maybe truer, because in the theosophical view, there is no plane of manifestation where these two aspects are not. If we cannot have pure spirit, we cannot have pure matter. We can go beyond both spirit and matter, and we are talking about something that is neither. It's a unit or a unity that is beyond both. But if we go high enough on the spiritual planes, it looks like matter is almost not there. Matter is so spiritual that in practical terms, we may be tempted to say there is only consciousness. Now, even though that may be true on the higher spiritual planes, when we are talking about our experience on the physical plane, the reality is that matter heavily conditions our consciousness. Many things that we call my consciousness, they are coming from the vehicles of consciousness, from the physical body, from the emotional body, from the mental body. So we cannot really separate consciousness from the vehicle of consciousness. We have to deal with both. And this is the theosophical approach to the spiritual path, as we are going to see. So then, in another quote, Annie Besant says, as consciousness unfolds on one plane after another, it does not thereby follow that it will be able to directly affect the physical brain from the higher planes. So we are talking about these two aspects of a human being. Our consciousness, maybe, in the theosophical view, there are different planes of consciousness. There is the physical plane, there is an astral or emotional plane, mental plane, and there are spiritual planes. We may be developing our consciousness on the higher planes, but the fact that our consciousness is unfolding, is evolving on the higher planes, does not mean that evolution, that expansion, that unfolding will necessarily express itself through the brain when we are in our waking state of consciousness. We tend to think that if our consciousness evolves, obviously that will show up in our personal nature. Well, that is not necessarily the case. And Ibesa says, the knowledge acquired on the higher planes may not be brought down into the physical mind and remembered. Then comes in the question of the vehicles in which it is to work. And we want to know how to improve our physical body, how to bring the astral and mental bodies into working order. Because the idea is that just as we are growing through our personal nature with what we study and meditate and learn from life, etc., we as a soul are also evolving on the higher planes. When the body is asleep, we come back to closer to our nature as a soul. And if we as a soul are awake on the inner planes, there are many things that we are doing and learning. But when we wake up, we may not remember any of that. And not only remember in terms of remembering facts, but that wisdom that the soul is beginning to awaken in itself, this inherent wisdom that we were talking about, may not be able to permeate the physical brain. So this is actually what happens according to the theosophical view with most of us. we are far wiser in our spiritual nature than what we are in our personal nature, far more. But our bodies, mental, emotional, and physical, just cannot receive and integrate and express that kind of wisdom. This is why Annie Besant says here, it's not only the spiritual evolution that we have to pay attention to, we need to also look at the evolution of the vehicles of consciousness, of the bodies. And this is why the two sides of evolution, the side of consciousness, the side of form, or spirit and matter, etc., are important if we are going to express that wisdom in our waking consciousness. So another important aspect of the Theosophical yoga, yoga as a path of union, is that its approach is holistic. It tends to be universal, all-encompassing. We have, for example, a quote by Subba Rao, who was an early member of the Theosophical Society. He was a contemporary of Blavatsky, and both Blavatsky and Subba Rao were disciples of the same master. And he says, some say that one should investigate Mahavakyas. This is a Sanskrit word for spiritual aphorisms. Especially in the Vedanta tradition, there are some spiritual aphorisms like, I am that, I am the divine, let's say, I am the universal self. So he says, some say that one should investigate, meditate on these aphorisms. Others, that the mind must be concentrated on a point, and the yogi must contemplate Parabrahman. Parabrahman is the ultimate reality. So some say, meditate on these aphorisms. Others say, just focus your mind on Parabrahman. Some say that one's own guru is the true subject of contemplation, and it is enough to lead a good life. So especially in the devotional traditions, one meditates on the guru as an expression of the divine, and then leads a good life. Some say that the repetition of pranava, of Om, is in itself Raja Yoga, the kingly yoga. And others say you must cultivate willpower. So you see, we have all these different approaches to spirituality and how to attain the spiritual goal, whatever spiritual goal a particular tradition proposes. So which of these is the true one, is the true path? And he says, all these are necessary and much more. Read Light on the Path. So you see, in the Theosophical view, there is this idea that no single path will lead you all the way to the realization of truth. Most schools teach one particular path, either the meditation on spiritual truths, or the concentration of the mind, as in Patanjali's yoga, or etc. Everything that Subba Rao mentioned, and many other approaches. And many schools tend to just focus on that particular path. The Theosophical approach is different. There is the idea that all of these things are really necessary. We can't choose one and reject the others. And he says, read Light on the Path. So he's referring to the following quote from this book. Light on the Path is a mystical book that was produced in the early years of the Theosophical Society. Seek out the way, not by any one road. To each temperament, there is one road which seems the most desirable. So we may have an intellectual nature, so we will lean toward intellectual approaches to spirituality, or we may have a devotional nature or a practical nature, etc. And naturally, we tend to go and do whatever feels more comfortable for us, more natural to us. So it is true, each temperament has a particular approach that seems more desirable. But the way, Light on the Path says, is not found by devotion alone, by religious contemplation alone, by ardent progress, by self-sacrificing labor, by studious observation of life. None alone can take the disciple more than one step onward. All steps are necessary to make up the ladder. This is a difficulty that people find when they encounter the Theosophical tradition. Most spiritual traditions tend to publicize rather narrow approaches to spirituality because it's easier. Probably, or for the most part, with people who are serious in their approach, in their practice within any particular tradition. There are many traditions that have a wider spiritual practice, but when their interface with the public tends to be quite narrow. One form of meditation, one main concept, one particular activity. Now, when people come to the Theosophical tradition, they don't find that. They don't find any particular technique of meditation proposed, although in Theosophical literature, there are many techniques of meditation that are proposed. They don't find any particular single concept that, as a slogan, is easy to repeat. There are many different concepts that are necessary to understand to look at things from the Theosophical perspective. Again, they don't find a particular action or way of life that is proposed to everybody, because there are many different actions or practices that are necessary. So people may feel either that the Theosophical tradition is vague or overwhelming or too embracing, and there is a truth in that. This is why those of us who are committed to the Theosophical tradition have to be aware of this and try to offer ways in which people can access, those who are interested, can access this particular way of life. This is what the Master was talking about. It falls on us to work out ways of life, ways of understanding life and ways of acting in life that can be applied and that can be embraced by those who are interested. But essentially, what people find when they come to the Theosophical tradition is that there are all these different elements that are part of the spiritual practice. We will see this more in the second talk. And another quote about this by a person, again, an early Theosophist who was a disciple for a while. He says, "The prescribed course of self-discipline is one of moral, mental, and physical development carried on in parallel lines." So in the Theosophical approach, we need to take care of the physical, emotional, mental, moral, spiritual dimensions of us as a human being. All of them need to be developed in ways that are in tune with the spiritual life. The physical nature, he says, must be rendered more ethereal and sensitive. The mental, more penetrating and profound. The moral, more self-denying and philosophical. So you see, and he's talking about a physical lifestyle, an intellectual course of development, a moral and emotional work to become less self-centered, etc. So another element that is important in the yoga of Theosophy is that we take life as the teacher. We take life as the training ground. Many traditions tend to run away from life in order to practice spirituality. So spirituality and daily life seem to be contradictory. Either one is immersed in the world and then has a mundane life, or one renounces the world, goes away from it, and then it has a spiritual life. The Theosophical approach integrates both. There is no difference between the so-called mundane life and the spiritual life when we learn how to integrate them. So, for example, in a book called The Voice of the Silence, written by Blavatsky, but she said that she learned these aphorisms during her training with her teachers. This book says, "Believe thou not that sitting in dark forests, in proud seclusion, and apart from men, will lead thee to the goal of final liberation. Think not that when the sins of thy gross form are conquered, thy duty is accomplished by nature and by man." So this first part of the quote is advising against living the world in proud seclusion, away from people. And it says it's not merely what evolution, the Theosophical approach is based on an evolutionary view. What evolution requires, it is not simply to stop doing wrong things, to stop wrong actions, to stop wrong desires, to stop wrong views. All this is relatively easy to accomplish if I go away from temptations. But even if I do that, and I can lead a life where I don't engage in sins, that is not enough from an evolutionary point of view. This is what the second sentence here says. And it continues, "So kindly acts, and thou shalt reap their fruition. Inaction in a deed of mercy becomes an action in a deadly sin." The Bhagavad Gita approached this problem of action and inaction. And basically, what we will see in these talks is that what it is required for a full realization of our true nature, from the Theosophical point of view at least, is not simply what we could call negative goodness. Negative in the sense of, I am good because I'm not actively doing evil things or harming or doing wrong things. That is a first step, but what is necessary is an active goodness. So kindly acts. We need to, because the Theosophical view says that we are all one, we cannot expect to be able to realize our true nature apart from the whole of manifestation. We will see this later. Therefore, in order to grow spiritually myself, I have to be an active or take an active part in the whole of creation growing spiritually. So the Voice of the Silence says, "Thus saith the sage, shalt thou abstain from action. Not so shall gain thy soul her freedom. To reach nirvana, one must reach self-knowledge, or knowledge of the self, of the universal self. And self-knowledge is of loving deeds the child." So in this approach, there is no possibility to realize the true self, which is one, if not by means of loving deeds, if not by the recognition of that self everywhere else. And therefore, because we recognize myself in everything else, the actions, my natural actions will be actions that tend to help that self in whatever expression it is taking. And Blavatsky said it in a blunt way. She says, the Hindu yogi who isolates himself in an impenetrable forest, like the Christian hermit who retires to the desert, are both of them but accomplished egoists or selfish. The one, the yogi, acts with the sole idea of finding in nirvana refuge against reincarnation. The other acts with the unique idea of saving his soul. Both of them think only of themselves. Their motive is altogether personal. So we need to understand, we will continue with this quote, but we need to understand that these quotes are talking about a principle. This doesn't mean that at some point in our lives we may choose to retire from the world. Even we could conceive that in one incarnation the soul may choose to retire from the world. So in that incarnation, most of the focus is on an inner search, for example. But as a principle, what the theosophical teachings are pointing here is that as a principle, if we are interested in our own salvation, in our own evolution, in our own liberation, that is the wrong approach. Eventually, that will lead to a dead end because it is based on the idea that I am different and isolated from the rest. So as a principle, that is not the path that the theosophical tradition proposes. Again, there may be individual, temporary instances of isolation, and that is okay, as long as the course of the soul, the growth of the soul overall has to do with realizing our oneness with everybody else and not just a self-centered search for liberation, salvation, etc. So Blavatsky says, now we protest not the ascetic life, that is, life entirely divorced, morally and mentally, from the world of ever-changing illusion. So she says, we are not talking against an ascetic life, but then see how she interprets this idea of ascetic life. An ascetic life on the moral and mental level, not on the physical level. Normally, the sense of asceticism is associated with going away from the world and not engaging in sensual pleasures, etc. So Blavatsky says, we are not against the ascetic life on a moral and mental level, but the life of a hermit, this is what she is against, useless to all and as useless to himself in the long run. So again, sure, a spiritual life of austerity, of refraining from engaging in activities that are, based on an illusion, all that is fine, as long as we do it mentally and morally. What she's talking against is running away from life physically, because then we isolate ourselves and we cannot help others. So what is the goal in this particular approach, in this path of yoga? We have been talking a little about that, but let's see this quote by Annie Besant. The way to begin to tread the path that leads to the place of peace is to endeavor to identify our consciousness with the true self. And the means are disengagement from the objects of the senses, carelessness as to results of our actions, and meditation ever renewed on the true self. So I think this is a quote that is representative of the theosophical view, the idea of searching for the true self. Now, in this view, the true self, there is only one self, a universal self. It's not personal, it's not my personal self. The personal self that we may call Pablo or whatever your personality is the universal self, which takes this particular coloring, and this is what we call the personal self. But essentially, it's the universal self. In you, the universal self may take a different coloring, different personal qualities, a different body, different emotional patterns, different mental patterns, but these are all accidents, not essences. You know, I'm using accident in the philosophical way. Accident in this way of talking is something that is not essential, is something that is temporary, that is added. So for example, you have a triangle. The triangle may be blue or maybe green. The color is not part of what a triangle essentially is. You may have a triangle that is green or blue, and they are both triangles. But having three sides is part of the essence of a triangle. You cannot have a triangle with only two sides. So all these personal aspects are part of additions which are not essential. It's the coloring that the true self is taking in this particular expression, in this particular manifestation. So what the Theosophical tradition aims at is discovering the true self, which is the one self. So there is but one self in all the infinite universe. And what we men call self is but the illusory reflection of the one self in the heaving waters of earth. So this is Blavatsky talking about what I just explained. True occultism, and she used the word occultism as I am using the path of yoga. True occultism is the destruction of the false idea of self, and therefore true spiritual perfection and knowledge are nothing else but the complete identification of our finite selves with the great all. So in this path, we have to destroy the false idea, not the false self. The self that is in me, in you, is true, is real. But there is the false idea that this self is my personal characteristics. So we need to destroy the idea that I am this particular personal characteristics to realize that I am the one self, which is dressing itself up in these particular characteristics. So by doing this, we identify ourselves with the one self. And then she says, it follows, therefore, that no spiritual progress at all is possible except by and through the bulk of humanity. It is only when the whole of humanity has attained happiness that the individual can hope to become permanently happy, for the individual is an inseparable part of the whole. So again, this is connected to what we were discussing about moving away from the world. There is no possibility of individual perfection unless the whole of humanity, and we could extend that to all sentient beings, attain perfection, whatever perfection is within their own kingdoms. What a perfect animal is from the point of view of evolution is different from what a perfect human being is. Each kingdom have their own evolutionary goals, let's say. But just focusing on humanity, what Blavatsky is saying here is that the perfection of the human self, let's call it, there is only one human self, and that human self will be perfect when all its manifestations are perfect. This is similar to the bodhisattva idea in Mahayana Buddhism, when the bodhisattva says, I'm not going to enter nirvana until all sentient beings attain nirvana also. Again, this is the principle. The principle is the understanding that I am this personality, or I am the self expressing through this personality as much as I am the self expressing through all the other personalities. The more I realize this, the more I understand that it is not a question of freeing this particular personality from illusion, because I, as the self, am still a slave of illusion in other personalities. So that is the view proposed here. So what we are going to see in our next lecture are the means to tread this particular theosophical yoga, let's call it. We will see that some of the typical means we find in literature are study, not only of books, but also of ourselves, of life, then meditation, not only as a formal session in which we sit to meditate, but also meditation in daily life as a state of awareness of a meditative attitude in daily life. Also, service is necessary, not only on the physical plane, service as giving people physical or addressing the physical needs, which is part of this, but also service on an emotional, a mental, and a spiritual levels. Then purification of our physical body, our emotional body, our mental body. We saw this in some of the quotes. And finally, self-mastery, again, of our whole nature, of the body, emotions, and mind, so that these aspects of our nature are an expression of our true self. The self in us is the master of the expression of our physical, emotional, and mental levels, and not the other way around, that we are led by physical, emotional, or mental reactions. But we will see this in our next lecture. Thank you.